The sky was bruised with the purples and deep oranges of dusk as we pulled onto the dirt road that led to the carnival grounds. The dust rising from Elliot's Plymouth spun in the amber light of our headlights, settling back like a restless spirit. Ahead, the remnants of the Laughing Gala sprawled in eerie disarray. Toppled stalls, torn canvas, and rows of burnt-out bulbs that dangled like brittle bones on string. The gala had left 2 days prior, taking its laughter with it, but not before leaving behind something far more sinister. Elliot was silent as he brought the car to a halt, cutting the engine. The quiet of the open Texas plains surged in, broken only by the faint sigh of the wind through the broken carnival signs. From the corner of my eye, I caught his hand moving instinctively to his pocket, tracing the outline of his notebook. It was always his first tool of choice, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, sharp and unyielding. 2 victims so far, he said at last, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, both with their faces frozen in those grins. He leaned back slightly, letting out a breath. Whatever it is, it started here. I swallowed hard. The image of the victims' grotesque smiles was etched in my memory, a twisted rictus of joy that had nothing to do with happiness. And you think it has something to do with those rumors about the masks? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot shot me a brief look, his gray eyes catching the fading light. Carnivals thrive on illusion, Miguel. But what we're dealing with here, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open, is far from make-believe. The air outside was cooler than I expected, carrying a faint metallic tang that set my nerves on edge. I followed Elliot as he moved with purpose toward the remnants of the carnival, his coat flaring slightly behind him with each determined step. The fading day clung stubbornly to the horizon, as though afraid to give way to whatever lay ahead. The first thing I noticed was the smell, an acrid, smoky stench that clawed at the back of my throat. The stalls we passed were in various states of collapse, their bright paint chipped and peeling, their once cheerful signs now sagging under the weight of grime and neglect. A carousel sat lopsided on its axis, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop, their wide eyes catching the glint of twilight. Over here, Elliot's voice was quiet, but it carried enough authority to pull me from my thoughts. He was crouched near one of the larger tents, or what was left of it. The fabric hung in long shreds, flapping lazily in the breeze. He held his flashlight steady, illuminating a patch of dirt where the ground looked disturbingly dark, almost black. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer immediately, his gloved hand brushing over the earth before holding something up to the light. It was a shard of what looked like porcelain, faintly curved. I crouched beside him, peering closer. A jagged edge caught the light, glinting faintly. "A piece of a mask?" I ventured. Elliot nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "More than likely, the victims were both seen at the carnival the night before their deaths. We're looking for connections." I straightened up, scanning the deserted grounds. It wasn't just the physical decay that unsettled me. It was the sense of something left behind, a presence almost lingering just beyond perception. The laughter had stopped, but the echoes remained, pressed into the very fabric of the place. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He glanced up, his gaze questioning. I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to articulate what I felt. "It's just, this place doesn't feel empty." He didn't dismiss me, which I appreciated. Instead, he stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his gloves. "Places like this rarely are," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Not when things like this have happened. We moved on, the crunch of our boots on the gravel loud against the quiet. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its skeletal frame stark against the twilight. It wasn't until we rounded the corner near the ticket booth that we found the first sign of something truly disturbing. The booth's glass window had been shattered, the shards glittering like spilled starlight across the ground. But it was the smeared handprint on the wood paneling that caught my attention, dark, almost black, and unmistakably fresh. "Blood," Elliot muttered, kneeling to examine it. He held the flashlight steady, tracing the outline of the print with his eyes. His expression was inscrutable, but I knew him well enough to recognize the flicker of unease behind his calm exterior. "Whoever it belongs to didn't get far," he said, rising to his feet. He turned, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness. "Look there." I followed his gaze and felt a chill ripple through me. A trail of smeared footprints led away from the booth, winding between the stalls and disappearing into the shadows beyond. They were erratic, as though the person had been stumbling. "We follow," Elliot said simply, already moving forward. I hesitated for the briefest of moments before falling into step behind him. The wind had picked up, rustling the tattered banners and sending loose debris skittering across the ground. The farther we went, the more pronounced the sense of wrongness became, like a weight pressing against my chest. The trail led us to what had once been the heart of the carnival, the central tent. It was massive, its striped fabric sagging like the deflated lungs of some great beast. The entrance yawned before us, a black maw that seemed to swallow the light of our flashlights. Elliot paused just outside, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of the small knife he kept tucked in his coat. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't planning on wandering off," I replied, though the attempt at humor fell flat even to my own ears. We stepped inside, the darkness enveloping us like a shroud. The air was heavy here, laden with the same acrid tang I'd noticed earlier. Our footsteps echoed softly on the packed dirt floor, the sound muffled by the oppressive silence. The beam of Elliot's flashlight swept across the space, revealing the remnants of the gala's main attraction. The stage was still intact, though its paint was chipped and faded. Props lay scattered across the floor, broken chairs, torn banners, and what looked like the remains of a shattered mirror. But it was what stood at the center of the stage that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a mannequin, or at least that's what I thought at first. It stood unnaturally still, dressed in what must have once been an elaborate costume. The fabric hung in tatters, revealing a thin, almost skeletal frame. But it was the face that held my attention. The porcelain mask, cracked and stained, its frozen smile mocking us with its silent laughter. Elliot stepped closer, his movements measured. He stopped at the edge of the stage, his flashlight trained on the figure. "It's not just a prop," he said quietly. "Look at the hands." I did. They were flesh, not wood, not porcelain. Flesh, pale and motionless, hanging limp at the figure's sides. The realization sent a jolt of cold fear through me. "Elliot, what is this?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure. Then, without warning, the laughter began. It started soft, almost imperceptible, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It grew steadily, rising in pitch and intensity, until it filled the tent, echoing off the walls and clawing at my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The laughter hung in the air like a frayed thread, unraveling the silence in its wake. My pulse hammered against my ribs, each beat rattling the edges of my sanity. I held my breath, straining to hear where the sound had come from, but it seemed to weave in and out of the shadows, slipping through our grasp. Elliot was already moving. His flashlight's beam cut through the suffocating darkness of the tent, illuminating nothing but the ghostly shapes of tattered banners and discarded props. The mannequin on the stage stood motionless, its cracked porcelain mask fixed in a frozen grin. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, its hollow eyes tracking our every move. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Elliot didn't answer. His focus was absolute, his movements deliberate as he scanned the area. He didn't look afraid, he never did. But there was a tension in his posture, a slight stiffness in his shoulders that told me he wasn't taking any chances. I forced myself to take a step forward, my shoes crunching softly against the dirt floor. The smell of mildew and decay grew stronger the closer I got to the stage, mingling with the faint metallic tang of old blood. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination conjuring ghosts of the past. The laughter came again, sharper this time, echoing from somewhere deeper within the tent. It was different now, less jovial, more menacing. My stomach churned as a shiver crawled up my spine. "Over here." Elliot's voice was low but firm, grounding me in the present. He stood near a cluster of overturned chairs, his flashlight trained on something in the dirt. I hurried to his side, careful not to disturb whatever he'd found. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a smear of ash, dark and powdery against the earth. But as I crouched beside Elliot, I noticed the faint outline of a handprint etched into the dirt, as though someone or something had pressed it there. "It's fresh," Elliot said, his tone clipped. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the tent. "Whoever or whatever was here, they're not far." The unease in his voice sent another ripple of fear through me. Elliot rarely admitted to being unnerved, and the fact that he was now only heightened my sense of dread. "Do you think it's connected to the mannequin?" I asked, gesturing toward the stage. Elliot didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked to the figure, lingering for a moment before he turned back to the handprint. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're not leaving until we find out." He started toward the far end of the tent, his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. I hesitated, glancing back at the mannequin one last time before following him. The grin on its mask seemed wider now, its jagged edges catching the dim light like teeth. The air grew colder as we ventured deeper into the tent, the temperature dropping with each step. My breath misted in front of me, curling into delicate spirals before dissipating into the void. The laughter had stopped again, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the darkness itself was alive and waiting. We came to a stop near what appeared to be the dressing area for the performers. The space was cluttered with broken mirrors, empty trunks, and racks of tattered costumes. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, its feeble glow casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Elliot's flashlight beam landed on a full-length mirror leaning against one of the racks. The glass was cracked, splintering the reflection into jagged fragments. But it wasn't the cracks that caught my attention. It was the movement. Something shifted in the reflection, a flicker of motion that didn't belong to either of us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to make sense of what I was seeing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a shadow darting across the edges of the mirror, just out of reach. "Elliot," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. "I see it," he replied, his tone calm but tense. He stepped closer to the mirror, his flashlight steady in his grip. The beam illuminated the surface, but the shadow was gone, leaving only our fractured reflections staring back at us. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. What was that? Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small vial of powder, a blend of herbs and minerals he often used in cases involving the supernatural. He sprinkled a thin line across the base of the mirror, murmuring something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. The air around us seemed to shift, growing heavier, denser. The faint hum of electricity buzzed in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I saw the shadow flicker again, darting across the cracks in the glass. But then it was gone, leaving only the fractured silence in its wake. "Whatever it was," Elliot said finally, straightening up, "it's not tied to this mirror, at least not anymore." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the tension in my chest easing slightly, but the relief was short-lived. From somewhere deeper within the tent, the laughter started again, louder this time, echoing off the walls like a sinister chorus. Elliot's jaw tightened, his grip on the flashlight firm. "It's leading us somewhere," he said, his voice low. "We need to keep moving." I nodded, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. But I trusted Elliot, more than I trusted myself, sometimes, and so I followed him into the darkness, my footsteps hesitant but determined. The source of the laughter wasn't hard to find. It led us to a small, hidden alcove at the very back of the tent. The space was cramped, barely large enough for the two of us to stand side by side. A single spotlight hung from the ceiling, its beam focused on a pedestal in the center of the room. Resting on the pedestal was another mask. This one was different from the mannequins, more ornate, with intricate patterns etched into the porcelain. The surface shimmered faintly, as though it was alive, and the grin that stretched across its features was impossibly wide, curving up into the hollow blackness of its eyes. Elliot approached cautiously, his movements measured. He examined the mask without touching it, his flashlight tracing the patterns on its surface. "It's one of Grinelli's," he said after a moment, his voice laced with certainty. I frowned. "How can you tell?" "The craftsmanship," he replied, gesturing to the intricate designs. Grinelli was known for his attention to detail, and the energy, it's different, stronger. The air around us seemed to thrum with an unseen force, the weight of it pressing against my skin. I took a step back, the urge to put as much distance between myself and the mask as possible overwhelming. "What do we do with it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer right away. He studied the mask for a long moment before reaching into his coat and pulling out a small cloth sack. "We take it with us," he said finally, "but we need to be careful. Whatever power it holds, it's dangerous." I hesitated, the thought of carrying the cursed object sending a chill down my spine. But I trusted Elliot, and so I helped him carefully place the mask into the sack, taking care not to touch it directly. As we left the alcove, the laughter followed us, its echoes growing fainter with each step. But even as the sound faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the mask, even hidden away, still had its eyes on us. The drive back into town was cloaked in silence. Elliot kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the cloth sack that now held the mask, his fingers unconsciously tracing its edges as though searching for answers hidden beneath the fabric. Moonlight spilled through the windows of the Plymouth, pooling in restless shadows that flickered with every twist and turn of the road. I stared out into the darkness, trying to shake the weight pressing against my chest. But the image of that grinning mask lingered like an afterimage burned into my mind. "Do you think it's awake?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. The question felt absurd, but the mask hadn't seemed like an ordinary object. Not even close. Elliot's jaw tightened. "It's aware," he said after a pause, his voice low, contemplative. "But whether it's truly conscious or just a vessel for whatever force Grinelli left behind, I'm not sure." That was the thing about Elliot. He never rushed to conclusions, even when every sign screamed for one. His calm, measured approach was what made him so good at what he did. It was also maddeningly frustrating when I wanted answers to put my mind at ease. We pulled into the motel parking lot just after midnight. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, a restless tension that seemed to mirror the unease churning in my gut. Elliot grabbed the sack and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. I followed, glancing nervously over my shoulder as we made our way to the room. The night felt too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Once inside, Elliot wasted no time. He cleared the small desk of its clutter, a chipped ashtray, a yellowed motel directory, and carefully placed the sack in the center. He stood over it for a moment, his hands resting on the desk's edge, before finally unwrapping the mask. In the harsh light of the motel lamp, it looked even more grotesque. The patterns etched into the porcelain shimmered faintly, the intricate swirls and lines almost hypnotic. The grin seemed wider now, impossibly so, curving upward into the hollow black pits of its eyes. Elliot crouched down, inspecting it closely. "The craftsmanship is impeccable," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Every detail deliberate, precise." Grinelli wasn't just a magician. He was an artist who cursed innocent people and trapped their souls in masks. I said, my unease slipping into irritation. "Let's not forget that." Elliot glanced up at me, one corner of his mouth twitching in something that might have been a smile if the circumstances were less grim. "True," he admitted, "but understanding his methods might be the key to undoing his work." I sighed, running a hand through my hair as I paced the room. "So what's the plan? We can't just sit here staring at it all night." "No," Elliot agreed, rising to his feet. He crossed to his bag and retrieved a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with notes and sketches from past cases. "We start with research. We need to find out everything we can about this mask, who it belonged to, how it was made, and why." "And you think this thing is going to tell us that?" I asked, gesturing to the mask. "Not directly," Elliot said, flipping through the journal. "But every curse has a story. We just have to listen." I wasn't entirely convinced, but I knew better than to argue. Elliot's instincts had gotten us out of more than a few tight spots, and if he believed the mask held answers, then I'd follow his lead. As Elliot buried himself in his journal, I took the opportunity to examine the mask more closely. Despite my earlier reluctance, I couldn't help but be drawn to it, my curiosity warring with the unease coiling in my chest. The patterns on its surface seemed to shift as I stared, the lines twisting and curling like living tendrils. I blinked, shaking my head to dispel the illusion, but the sensation lingered, a faint, creeping presence at the edge of my awareness. "Do you feel that?" I asked, glancing at Elliot. He didn't look up. "Feel what?" Like, like it's watching us." Elliot's pen paused mid-scratch, his eyes flicking to the mask before returning to the page. "It's not watching," he said calmly. "It's waiting." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I turned away from the mask, focusing instead on the familiar rhythm of Elliot's work, the rustle of pages, the scratch of his pen, the occasional muttered observation. It was grounding, a reminder that we weren't entirely at the mercy of whatever dark forces surrounded us. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden noise shattered the quiet, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from somewhere outside. I froze, my eyes darting to the window. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. Elliot stood, his expression sharp, alert. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out into the night. I joined him, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the parking lot below. At first, I didn't see anything. The lot was empty, the dim glow of the neon sign casting long shadows across the pavement. But then, near the edge of the lot, I saw it, a figure barely visible in the gloom. It was a woman, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of the sign. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted to one side as though listening for something. Then, slowly, she began to move, her steps deliberate, almost mechanical. The tapping grew louder. "She's wearing a mask," I whispered, my throat tight. Elliot didn't respond, his focus unbroken. He reached for his coat, slipping it on with practiced ease. "Stay here," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The hell I will," I shot back, grabbing my own jacket. "You're not going out there alone." He didn't protest, but the look he gave me made it clear he wasn't happy about it. Together, we slipped out of the room, the cool night air biting against my skin. The woman was still there, her movements slow and deliberate as she crossed the lot. We approached cautiously, the gravel crunching beneath our boots. The tapping sound seemed to echo with every step, a hollow, rhythmic beat that set my teeth on edge. As we drew closer, I could see the mask she wore, a simple white porcelain face with a narrow, angular grin. It wasn't as ornate as the one we'd found, but it had the same unsettling presence, the same hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. "Ma'am," Elliot called out, his voice steady but firm. The woman stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward us with an unnatural jerk. For a moment, she simply stood there, her masked face turned in our direction. Then, without warning, she let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh, a sound that sent ice coursing through my veins. Elliot stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she began to laugh again, her head tilting back as the sound grew louder, more distorted. The tapping resumed, though I couldn't see its source. It was as though the sound was coming from within her, a hollow echo reverberating through the night. And then she charged. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment she was standing there, and the next she was hurtling toward us, her movements wild and erratic. Elliot pushed me aside, stepping into her path with a fluid motion that spoke of years of experience. He ducked under her outstretched arms, driving his shoulder into her midsection and sending her sprawling to the ground. But she didn't stay down. She scrambled to her feet with inhuman speed, her laughter ringing out once more. Her mask glinted in the dim light, its empty eyes fixed on Elliot as she lunged for him again. This time he was ready. He sidestepped her attack, drawing his knife in one smooth motion. The blade caught the light as he swung, slicing through the air, and the mask. The woman froze, her body trembling as the mask cracked down the center. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, and then she collapsed, the porcelain fragments scattering across the pavement. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Elliot knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. After a moment, he shook his head, his expression grim. "She's gone." I stared at the broken mask, my mind racing. "What the hell is happening, Elliot?" He didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the fragments of porcelain. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's not over." The woman's laugh echoed in my ears long after she had fallen silent. The sound had burrowed into my thoughts, a grotesque melody that replayed itself in cruel loops. As we stood over her lifeless body, the night seemed to press in around us, heavy with something unseen. I had never known silence to feel so loud, so charged with invisible threads pulling at the edges of reality. Elliot crouched beside the woman, his flashlight casting harsh shadows across her still figure. Her broken mask lay scattered on the pavement, fragments of porcelain gleaming faintly under the motel's buzzing neon light. Her face beneath was pale and gaunt, her features lined with the weight of years, or something far darker. "She was already lost," Elliot muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was a finality in his tone that sent a chill through me. He turned one of the mask's shards over in his gloved hand, studying the intricate patterns etched into its surface. Whatever held her wasn't letting go. I crossed my arms, my unease coiling tighter with every passing second. But what was she doing here? Why come after us? Elliot rose to his feet, tucking the shard into his coat pocket. "I don't think she came after us specifically," he said. "I think she was drawn to the mask. Or rather, it called to her." I glanced toward the motel room, where the cursed object was tucked away inside. Even with the door closed and several walls between us, I could feel its pull, like a faint hum vibrating in my chest. "So what now? Do we stay here with that thing?" Elliot didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the darkened street beyond the parking lot, his expression distant, as though he was piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Finally, he turned back to me. "We need more information," he said, "and I know just the person to ask." We arrived at the library just as the sun began to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the quiet streets of Abilene. The building was a relic from another era, its weathered stone facade and heavy wooden doors standing as a testament to a time when knowledge was revered as sacred. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of aged paper hanging in the air like a memory. Elliot led the way, his steps purposeful as we navigated the labyrinth of shelves. It didn't take long to find who we were looking for. Miss Adelaide Humphreys sat at a desk in the corner, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she pored over a stack of books. She was a fixture of the library, a living encyclopedia of local history and lore. "Adelaide," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. She looked up, startled, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took us in. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone clipped. "I haven't seen you in some time. I assume you're here on business." Elliot nodded. "We need your expertise. Have you ever heard of Lorenzo Grinelli?" Her expression shifted, A flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, crossing her features before she masked it behind her usual air of professionalism. She removed her glasses, setting them down carefully on the desk. Grinelli? She murmured, the name hanging in the air like a shadow. Yes, I've heard of him. He was a magician, a performer, but more than that. They say he dabbled in the occult. That's putting it lightly, I muttered, earning a sharp glance from Elliot. Adelaide leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. Why do you ask? Surely you're not chasing carnival ghosts. This is more than ghost stories, Elliot said, his tone even. He reached into his coat and retrieved the shard of the mask, holding it out for her to see. This belonged to one of his creations. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as she leaned forward to get a closer look. The masks, she whispered, almost to herself. I thought they were just rumors. They're very real, Elliot said, and they're dangerous. We need to know everything you can tell us about Grinelli, the masks, and whatever power he tapped into. Adelaide hesitated, her gaze lingering on the shard. Then she rose from her chair, moving with a deliberate slowness toward one of the shelves. There's a book, she said, her voice quieter now. A collection of accounts from those who encountered him. It's not well known. Most libraries wouldn't have it, but this one does. She returned a moment later, carrying a worn leather-bound volume. The title was embossed in faded gold letters, The Forgotten Faces, a study of Grinelli's legacy. She placed it on the desk, her fingers brushing over the cover as though she were reluctant to let it go. This might help, she said, looking up at Elliot. But I'd be careful, Mr. Brooks. Grinelli's masks were said to be cursed, artifacts of his experiments with life and death. To study them is to invite danger. Elliot gave a small nod, his expression unreadable as he picked up the book. Thank you, Adelaide. Your help is appreciated, as always. She didn't respond, her gaze drifting back to the mask shard still sitting on the desk. There was a sadness in her eyes, as though she was mourning something long lost. Back at the motel, the atmosphere had grown heavier, the air thick with a palpable tension. The book sat open on the desk, its pages filled with detailed sketches and handwritten accounts of Grinelli's work. The illustrations were haunting, twisted faces, masks with hollow eyes and unnatural grins, each one more unsettling than the last. As Elliot read, I found myself drawn to one particular image, a mask identical to the one we'd found, its swirling patterns and wide grin captured in precise detail. The accompanying text described it as the dancer's mask, said to grant its wearer unnatural grace and agility, but at a terrible cost. The dancer, I said aloud, my voice breaking the silence. Does that mean there are others? Other masks, I mean. Elliot glanced up from the book, his expression grim. Yes, he said. Grinelli created several, each one unique, each one tied to a specific performer. They were his experiments, his way of pushing the limits of human ability, and trapping their souls in the process. I added, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. Elliot didn't deny it. Instead, he closed the book and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. The question is, why now? Grinelli's been gone for decades. The masks should have faded into obscurity, yet here they are, resurfacing. Maybe someone found them, I suggested, brought them back. Maybe, Elliot said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Or maybe they've been waiting for something, for someone. The thought sent a shiver through me, the weight of the mask's presence pressing against my chest like a physical force. I didn't know what Grinelli's endgame had been, but I had a sinking feeling we were about to find out. The sound of laughter broke the stillness, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside this time, it was coming from the mask. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to turn my blood to ice. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, like a mocking whisper carried on the wind. My eyes shot to the desk where the mask lay. Its grotesque grin seemed even more pronounced now, the patterns etched into its surface shimmering faintly in the dim motel room light. "Elliot," I said, my voice tight, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "It's laughing." He didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on the mask, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached for his notebook, flipping it open to a blank page, and began jotting something down in his precise, methodical handwriting. I wanted to shake him, to demand that he tell me he had a plan, but the air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as though the mask itself were listening. The laughter grew louder, a faint, hollow echo that seemed to seep into the walls. It wasn't coming from the mask directly. It felt like it was all around us, vibrating in the very air we breathed. I stepped back instinctively, my legs bumping against the edge of the bed. "What the hell is it doing?" I asked, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to sound calm. Elliot finally looked up, his gaze sharp and focused. "It's not the mask," he said, his voice steady. "At least not entirely. Something's connected to it, something trying to break through." That wasn't exactly reassuring. "And we're just going to let it?" I asked, gesturing wildly at the desk. "You don't think maybe we should, I don't know, get rid of it?" Elliot's lips quirked in a faint, humorless smile. "Getting rid of it won't stop whatever this is. If we destroy the mask without understanding its purpose, we could make things worse." "Worse?" I repeated incredulously. How could it possibly get worse than a laughing mask and a dead woman in the parking lot? Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the desk, his fingers brushing over the edge of the leather-bound book Adelaide had given us. He flipped it open to a section near the middle, the pages filled with detailed sketches of masks and notes written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand. "This isn't just a curse," he said after a moment, his eyes scanning the text. "It's a tether. Grinelli didn't just trap souls in these masks. He used them to create a bridge, a way to anchor himself to this world even after death." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "You're saying he's still here? That he's alive?" "Not alive," Elliot said, his tone clipped. "Not in the traditional sense. But his essence, his will, it's still out there, connected to these masks. And whatever's happening now, it's because that connection is growing stronger." The laughter stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-echo. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. I realized I was holding my breath and exhaled shakily, my pulse hammering in my chest. Before I could say anything, a loud knock shattered the quiet, echoing through the room like a gunshot. I jumped, my heart lurching into my throat as I turned toward the door. Elliot was already moving, his hand resting on the knife tucked into his coat as he approached cautiously. "Who is it?" he called, his voice calm but firm. There was no answer, just another knock, slower this time, each thud reverberating through the room. I glanced at the mask, half expecting it to start laughing again, but it remained still, its grin frozen in place. Elliot reached the door and hesitated for a moment before pulling it open a crack. The chain was still latched, giving him just enough room to peer outside. I stood behind him, my fists clenched at my sides as I tried to make sense of the dark figure standing on the other side. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He wore a long coat that hung loosely from his frame, the fabric worn and tattered at the edges. His hands were bare, pale against the darkness, and they hung limply at his sides. "Can I help you?" Elliot asked, his tone cautious. The man tilted his head slightly, the movement slow and deliberate, almost like he was studying us. When he spoke, his voice was low and rasping, the words dragging like nails across a chalkboard. "You have something of his," the man said. Elliot's grip on the door tightened. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulling out a small, ornate box. He held it up, the wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. "He wants it back," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's eyes flicked to the box, his jaw tightening. "Tell him he can't have it." For a moment, the man didn't move. Then, slowly, he lowered the box, his fingers curling around it like claws. "He'll come for it," he said, his voice cold. "And for you." Elliot didn't respond. He slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt and leaning against it as he exhaled heavily. I stared at him, my mind racing with questions, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "We need to leave," he said, his tone brisk. "Now." I didn't argue. I grabbed my bag, shoving what little I had into it as Elliot gathered the mask and the book. Within minutes, we were in the car, the engine rumbling to life as we pulled out of the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the night. "Who was that?" I asked finally, breaking the tense silence. Elliot's grip on the wheel tightened. "One of Grinelli's servants," he said. "Or what's left of him." The words sent a chill down my spine. "So what do we do now?" Elliot didn't answer right away. He stared straight ahead, his expression grim, as though he were calculating our next move. Finally, he said, "We find the other masks. If Grinelli is trying to return, they're the key." "And how exactly do we do that?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "It's not like they're just lying around waiting to be found." Elliot glanced at me, his gray eyes sharp and determined. "They're not waiting," he said. "They're waking up." The highway stretched endlessly before us, a shadowy ribbon cutting through the black expanse of the Texas night. Elliot drove with his usual calm precision, his hands steady on the wheel, but I could sense the storm brewing behind his composed exterior. The events of the past few hours hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. The encounter with the masked man, the chilling promise he had delivered. It all circled in my mind like vultures around a dying animal. The mask sat between us, wrapped tightly in the cloth sack and secured in a small wooden crate Elliot had pulled from the trunk. Even though I couldn't see it, I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that seemed to draw the oxygen out of the car. I couldn't help but glance at it every few minutes, as if expecting it to burst free and reveal the horrors it held. "You're quiet," Elliot said, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence. He didn't take his eyes off the road. "I'm trying to figure out how we ended up here," I admitted, leaning back against the seat. A dead woman, a cursed mask, and a man who might as well have crawled out of a nightmare telling us we're next. It's a lot. Elliot's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. It's never simple, is it? Simple would be nice for a change, I muttered, crossing my arms. Do you think he'll come after us? Not immediately, Elliot replied. He won't risk confronting us unless he's certain he can get the mask. But we can't rely on that. We need to stay ahead of him and find the others before he does. And how exactly do we do that? I asked, gesturing vaguely to the dark expanse around us. We barely know anything about the masks, let alone where they might be. Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the shard of porcelain he had taken from the masked woman. He held it up to the dashboard light, turning it over in his hand as if searching for something hidden in its intricate patterns. They're connected, he said after a moment. The masks, they were created together, bound by the same force. If we can figure out how that connection works, we might be able to trace it. And how do we do that? I pressed, though I already knew what he was going to say. Adelaide mentioned a man, Elliot said, his tone thoughtful. The author of the book she gave us, William Stokes. He was one of the few who studied Grinelli's work in depth. If anyone can help us, it's him. And where do we find this Stokes? I asked, already dreading the answer. Boston, Elliot said simply, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. We'll be there by tomorrow night. I let out a sigh, leaning my head against the window and watching the darkened landscape blur past. Of course it's Boston. The next day found us in the heart of Boston, a city that felt like a world away from the dusty expanse of Texas. The buildings loomed tall and gray against the overcast sky, their stone facades weathered by time and history. The streets buzzed with activity, but beneath the surface, there was a sense of unease, a feeling that something unseen lurked just out of sight. William Stokes lived in a narrow, three-story townhouse on a quiet side street. The curtains were drawn, and the windows were grimy, giving the impression of a place that had been forgotten by the world. Elliot knocked on the door with his usual air of quiet authority, and we waited in silence, the sound of the city fading into the background. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a thin, wiry man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His hair was wild and unkempt, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been changed in days. He eyed us suspiciously, his gaze lingering on Elliot before shifting to me. William Stokes, Elliot asked, his tone polite but firm. The man's eyes narrowed. Who's asking? Elliot Brooks, he said, extending a hand. This is Miguel Vasquez. We're here about Grinelli. Stokes stiffened, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. For a moment, I thought he was going to slam it in our faces, but then he stepped aside, gesturing for us to come in. The interior of the townhouse was as cluttered and chaotic as its owner. Books and papers were stacked on every available surface, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Stokes led us to a small sitting room, where he cleared off a pair of chairs before sinking into one himself. You're either very brave or very foolish to come here, he said, his eyes darting between us. Grinelli's work is dangerous, to say the least. We're aware, Elliot said, his tone even. He reached into his coat and retrieved the wooden crate, setting it on the table between us. That's why we need your help. Stokes hesitated, his gaze flicking to the crate as though it might bite him. What's in there? Elliot opened the crate, carefully unwrapping the cloth to reveal the mask. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, as though the mask's presence had a gravitational pull. Stokes leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "That's one of them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The dancer's mask." "You've seen it before?" Elliot asked. "In the book," Stokes said, gesturing vaguely to the stacks of papers around him. "I've studied the masks, their history, their power, but I've never seen one in person. I never wanted to." "Well, now you have," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "So what can you tell us?" Stokes hesitated, running a hand through his wild hair. "The masks were Grinelli's masterpieces," he said finally. "Each one was created for a specific performer, designed to enhance their abilities. But they came at a cost. The more the performers used them, the more the masks fed on their souls, until there was nothing left." "And then what?" I asked, leaning forward. "What happens to the souls?" "They're trapped," Stokes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bound to the masks. Forever." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I glanced at the mask, its frozen grin seeming to mock us, and felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Is there a way to break the connection?" Elliot asked, his voice steady. Stokes hesitated, his eyes flicking to the mask. "There's a ritual," he said finally, "but it's dangerous. If it goes wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic." Elliot's expression didn't waver. "We don't have a choice." The air inside William Stokes' townhouse felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward. The realization that we had a path forward, a ritual to sever the mask's connection to Grinelli, did little to ease my growing unease. Stokes was pale and visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he leafed through a tattered notebook. The rhythmic scratch of his pen punctuated the oppressive silence, a sound that did nothing to calm my fraying nerves. Elliot leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied the open book. His focus was unrelenting, the weight of everything we'd seen and learned reflected in the hard set of his jaw. The man could sit in a room full of ghosts and act as if he were reading the morning paper, but even he seemed more tense than usual. "This is it," Stokes finally said, his voice a thin rasp that cracked under the pressure of his words. He held the notebook out to Elliot, his bony fingers curling around its edges. "The ritual isn't just about breaking the connection. It's about containment. If you fail to complete it, the mask's power could spread unchecked. Everything Grinelli built will unravel, and it'll drag everyone else down with it." Elliot took the notebook, scanning the page with the clinical precision of a surgeon. "What do we need?" Stokes hesitated, glancing between Elliot and me. "The masks," he said simply. "All of them." My stomach dropped. "You're joking," I said, though I already knew he wasn't. "We've barely managed to get our hands on one. How the hell are we supposed to find the rest?" Stokes' lips pressed into a thin line, his sunken eyes filled with sympathy, or perhaps pity. "If you want to stop Grinelli, you'll find a way," he said. "Or you'll fail. There's no middle ground." I wanted to argue, to tell him how insane it was to expect us to gather a collection of cursed artifacts while a potentially immortal madman hunted us. But the words caught in my throat, smothered by the oppressive weight of reality. Stokes wasn't being cruel. He was being honest. And deep down, I knew Elliot had already made up his mind. "We'll find them," Elliot said, his voice calm and steady. He closed the notebook and tucked it into his coat, rising from his chair with the quiet resolve of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. I stared at him, incredulous. "We'll find them? That's your plan?" Elliot turned to me, his gray eyes unwavering. "We don't have a choice, Miguel." I wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration and fear clawing at my chest, but instead, I forced myself to nod. He was right, of course. He always was. It wasn't until we were back in the car, the notebook safely secured alongside the mask, that I let myself speak. The streets of Boston blurred past, their orderly chaos a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. "So where do we start?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Elliot didn't seem to notice. "The masks are connected," he said, his hands steady on the wheel. "If we can trace the energy binding them, it should lead us to the others." "And how exactly do we trace energy?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Last I checked, we're not exactly paranormal dowsing experts." Elliot's lips quirked in a faint, humorless smile. "That's where you come in." I blinked, caught off guard. "Me? You have a gift for seeing the patterns others miss," he said. "A way of understanding things that don't make sense to anyone else. You've always been my compass, Miguel, whether you realize it or not." The sincerity in his voice threw me off balance, my frustration fading into something warmer, more complicated. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I settled for a gruff nod, turning my attention back to the notebook. We drove for hours, following a trail of faint, fragmented clues buried in the pages of Stokes' notes. Each lead was tenuous at best, a thread barely visible against the backdrop of Grinelli's labyrinthine schemes. But Elliot pressed forward with unwavering determination, his instincts guiding us through the haze of uncertainty. The sun was beginning to set when we arrived at our next destination, an abandoned theater on the outskirts of a small New England town. The building loomed before us, its once grand facade crumbling under the weight of years and neglect. Faded posters clung to the walls, their edges curling like dried leaves, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. "This is it," Elliot said, cutting the engine. "The second mask is here." I stared at the theater, my skin prickling with unease. "How do you know?" He tapped the notebook, his expression inscrutable. "The dancer was connected to the performer," he said. "They were created as a pair, designed to complement each other." Grinelli's notes suggest this theater was the performer's last known location. "Convenient," I muttered, though I followed him out of the car without protest. The air was cool and damp, the faint rustle of leaves whispering through the stillness. It felt as though the theater itself were holding its breath, waiting for us to step inside. Elliot led the way, his movements sure and deliberate as we approached the building. The front doors were locked, but a side entrance yielded easily enough under his careful ministrations. The interior was even worse than the exterior, the once opulent lobby reduced to a husk of its former glory. Dust coated every surface, and the faint scent of decay clung to the air like a shroud. We moved in silence, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of grime beneath our boots. The theater loomed ahead, its cavernous expanse bathed in shadows. Rows of tattered seats stretched toward the stage, their once plush cushions now faded and torn. The air felt heavier here, the atmosphere charged with an unseen presence. Elliot paused at the edge of the stage, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. "It's here," he said, his voice low. I followed his line of sight, my eyes landing on a small pedestal at the center of the stage. A mask rested atop it, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was different from the dancer's mask, its features more angular, more commanding. The patterns etched into it seemed to shift as I stared, an unsettling illusion that sent a shiver down my spine. Elliot stepped onto the stage, his movements careful and deliberate. The air seemed to hum around him, the faint vibration growing stronger with each step. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay back, but I couldn't let him face it alone. Taking a deep breath, I climbed onto the stage and followed him. The closer we got to the mask, the stronger the pressure became, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. My breaths came shallow and fast, my pulse thundering in my ears. Elliot stopped just short of the pedestal, his hand hovering over the mask. "Careful," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He glanced at me, a flicker of something, determination, reassurance, passing across his features. Then, with a steady hand, he picked up the mask. The dim interior of the theater collapsed into chaos as soon as Elliot's fingers brushed the surface of the mask. A bone-deep chill swept through the room, tangible and immediate, as if every ounce of warmth had been yanked from the air in a single merciless instant. My instincts screamed at me to run, to escape the oppressive energy rising like a tidal wave, but I was rooted to the spot. Elliot snatched the mask from its pedestal with the precision of someone who knew there was no room for hesitation. The moment he lifted it, the building seemed to groan in protest, a guttural sound that resonated from the beams above to the cracked floor beneath our feet. "Put it down," I found myself saying, my voice rough, barely audible over the strange, guttural hum that reverberated throughout the room. My words barely reached him before the lights overhead flickered violently and then cut out entirely. Darkness enveloped the theater like a living thing, suffocating and absolute. My heart thudded erratically against my ribs. The faint silver glow of moonlight filtered through the boarded-up windows, casting jagged, dancing slashes of light across the stage. Elliot turned towards me, the mask cradled carefully in his gloved hands, his expression caught between defiance and unease. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady but low. I didn't need to be told twice. The air around us had shifted into something colder, stranger. Shadows flickered along the edges of the stage, too quick and insubstantial to be anything human. My hands curled into fists as the sound of muffled, dissonant whispers began to trickle through the room. At first, I thought they were just in my head, but they grew louder, circling us like predator and prey. And then it came, the laughter. It started faint, like an echo bouncing off empty walls, and quickly swelled to a cacophony that seemed to fill every corner of the theater. It was a sound too human and too alien at the same time, shifting pitches and tones as if it came from a dozen mouths at once. My skin crawled with the unnatural reverberations, a sickening chorus that seemed to rise from the cracks in the floor. "Elliot," I breathed, my throat dry. "Tell me you've got a plan." "Working on it," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room, cataloging and calculating even as the unseen force closed in. The laughter sharpened, felt personal now, mocking, like it knew things about us, things we didn't want to admit even to ourselves. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, worming its way into my skull. Suddenly, the darkness shifted. Shadows coalesced along the edges of the stage, blending together until they formed shapes, tall, thin, elongated shapes that moved with a slow, menacing fluidity. Figures stepped out from the blackness, their forms wrapped in tattered costumes that shimmered faintly in the dim light. But it was their faces, or lack of them, that froze my blood. Each of them wore masks, grinning and angular, their hollow eyes fixed directly on us. Elliot stood his ground, his posture rigid, as the masked figures crept closer. There were 5 of them, their footsteps eerily silent as they surrounded the stage. My mind raced, my body rigid with fear, as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. "What are they?" I whispered hoarsely. "Echoes," Elliot said, his voice even. "Fragments of the souls Grinelli bound to his masks. They're tied to this place. Guardians, in a way." "Guardians," I echoed, incredulous. "Guardians of what?" Before Elliot could answer, one of the figures lunged. It moved with an unnatural speed, its limbs jerking and bending at impossible angles as it closed the distance between us. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp, as Elliot raised his knife in a defensive arc. The blade caught the edge of the mask, sending the figure reeling with an inhuman screech. Another lunged from my right, forcing me to dive out of the way. My shoulders slammed into the floorboards, the impact jolting through my body as I scrambled to my feet. The masked figures moved with uncanny coordination, their attacks synchronized and relentless. Elliot fought them off with a precision that bordered on terrifying, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the stage, the splintered edge jagged enough to serve as a crude weapon. My muscles burned as I swung it wildly, barely managing to keep one of the figures at bay. Their movements were jerky and chaotic, but there was a terrifying intelligence behind their blank, grinning masks. They weren't mindless, they were playing with us. "Elliot!" I shouted, ducking as another figure swiped at me. "Whatever you're gonna do it fast." Elliot's gaze flicked to the mask in his hand, then to the pedestal it had rested on. His jaw tightened. "We need to break the connection," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "The pedestal, it's a conduit." "What does that mean?" I snapped, swinging my makeshift weapon at another masked figure. "It means it's holding them here," Elliot said. "Destroy it, and they lose their tether." I didn't have time to argue or overthink. I darted toward the pedestal, weaving between the masked figures as they closed in on me. My pulse thundered in my ears, every nerve screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But I pushed forward, adrenaline driving me. The pedestal loomed ahead, a simple, unremarkable block of stone that radiated an unsettling energy. The moment I reached it, the air around me seemed to thicken, resisting my every movement. I raised the splintered wood above my head, channeling every ounce of fear and anger into the blow. The impact was deafening. The pedestal cracked, a sharp, splintering sound that reverberated through the theater. For a moment, nothing happened. The masked figures froze, their grins faltering as a low, guttural hum began to rise from the stage. And then the room erupted. The shadows writhed and convulsed, the masked figures letting out unearthly wails as they dissolved into smoke and light. The air was electric, charged with a chaotic energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. I staggered backward, shielding my face as a shockwave rippled through the theater, shaking the walls to their foundations. When the dust settled, the theater was silent. The pedestal was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble, and the masked figures had vanished. I turned to Elliot, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, to find him staring at the mask in his hand. It no longer shimmered with the same unsettling light. It seemed dormant. "You did it," I said, my voice hoarse. "You broke the connection." Elliot didn't answer right away. He ran his thumb over the surface of the mask, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up, his gray eyes meeting mine. "One connection," he said quietly. "There are still others. The weight of his words settled heavily between us, the enormity of what lay ahead pressing down like a storm cloud. My legs trembled as I leaned against the edge of the stage, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. But deep down, I knew Elliot was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The theater remained unervingly still after the chaos had died. But there was no mistaking the sense that something lingered, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of reason. Elliot and I stood on the stage, surrounded by splinters of shattered wood and the echoes of whatever force we'd just unleashed. The mask in Elliot's hand felt like the nucleus of it all, the weight of its presence oppressive even in the newfound silence. He turned it over carefully, his movements deliberate and measured. "It's dormant," he muttered under his breath, though his tone carried none of the relief I would have expected from those words. There was no victory in his expression, only calculation. I tried to steady my breathing, the adrenaline still coursing through me and leaving my muscles taut with tension. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice rasping against the quiet. "We've got the second mask. What now?" Elliot glanced up at me, his sharp gray eyes momentarily softening as though he could see the frayed edges of my composure. "Now," he said, tucking the mask into the crate alongside the first one, "we figure out how to put this all to rest. For good." My shoulders sagged, and I sank onto the edge of the stage, the exhaustion catching up to me in a sudden rush. "Elliot, I don't know how much more of this I can take," I admitted, scrubbing a hand over my face. "These masks, these things, whatever they are, it's like they're alive, like they're trying to tear us apart." "They are," he said simply, his tone devoid of comfort. "That's what they were designed to do. Grinelli didn't just create them to enhance performance. He gave them purpose. And their purpose isn't finished yet." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me like an anvil. "You make it sound like we're up against something unstoppable." Elliot didn't respond right away. He turned, scanning the theater with a practiced eye, as though searching for some clue we might have overlooked. His silence was answer enough. The drive back to the motel was quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzed with unspoken tension. My grip on the armrest was tight enough to leave an imprint on my palm, the faint hum of the engine the only sound filling the void between us. The masks were secured in the back seat, but their presence felt anything but distant. They were here with us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for what I didn't want to know. Elliot pulled into the motel parking lot, the neon vacancy sign casting a pale red glow over the cracked pavement. The weight of the night seemed to settle around us as we stepped out of the car, the faint chirp of crickets doing little to dispel the suffocating quiet. Inside the room, Elliot placed the crate on the desk and opened the notebook we'd taken from Stokes. He flipped through the pages with the same meticulous focus he brought to everything, his brow furrowed as he scanned the handwritten notes and diagrams. I sat on the edge of the bed, my legs bouncing nervously as the silence stretched on. "Anything useful in there?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended. Elliot didn't look up. "It's not about finding something useful," he said, his tone clipped. "It's about understanding." Grinelli wasn't just trying to tether himself to this world. He was trying to build something. A network, a system. These masks aren't just artifacts. They're nodes in a larger web. The words sent a shiver down my spine. "A web for what?" He finally looked up, his expression grim. "Power. Control." Grinelli wasn't content with immortality. He wanted dominion. "And if we don't stop this, he'll get it." I let out a shaky breath, running a hand through my hair. You make it sound like he's still out there, waiting to finish what he started. Elliot's gaze didn't waver. He is. The weight of his certainty settled heavily between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the storm we were walking into. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it was impossible, that Grinelli was long dead and buried, but I knew better than to doubt Elliot's instincts. If he said Grinelli was still a threat, I believed him. The night stretched on, heavy and restless. I couldn't sleep, not with the masks in the room, their oppressive energy saturating the air like a low hum just beneath the surface of perception. Elliot didn't seem bothered. He sat at the desk, his pen scratching across the pages of his notebook as he charted the connections between the masks and Grinelli's network. His focus was unrelenting, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind. I paced the room, my thoughts racing in circles. "We need a plan," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Something concrete. We can't keep stumbling from one disaster to the next, hoping we'll figure it out as we go." "We have a plan," Elliot said without looking up. "We gather the masks. We sever their connection to Grinelli. We end this. And what happens if we can't?" I pressed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "What happens if we're too late? If this thing, whatever it is, gets out of control?" Elliot's pen paused mid-stroke, and he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Then we deal with it," he said simply. I wanted to scream, to shake him and demand more than just cold, clinical resolve, but the words died in my throat. Elliot wasn't ignoring the stakes. He was carrying them, every ounce of the weight crushing down on him like a silent burden. He didn't need my frustration. He needed my help. I sank back onto the bed, letting out a heavy sigh. "You're lucky I trust you," I muttered. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a rare crack in his steely exterior. "I'd say the same about you," he said, turning back to his notes. The tension in the room eased, if only slightly, and I let myself relax, my eyes drifting to the ceiling. For the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of calm, a fleeting moment of quiet before the storm. But it didn't last. The sound of laughter shattered the stillness, sharp and jarring. It was faint at first, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the room. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat bolt upright, my eyes darting to the desk where the masks lay. Elliot was already on his feet, his knife drawn as he scanned the room with precise, measured movements. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, filling the air with its unnatural resonance. It wasn't coming from the masks, not directly. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once, a haunting symphony of malice. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. My breath fogged in the air, and I clutched my arms to my chest, the chill seeping into my bones. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. His focus was locked on the masks, his jaw tight as the laughter reached a deafening crescendo. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to dance and writhe across the walls. And then, with a sharp, jarring crack, the crate splintered open. The masks spilled onto the desk, their surfaces shimmering with a strange, otherworldly light. The patterns etched into them twisted and shifted, alive with an energy that defied logic or understanding. I scrambled backward, my instincts screaming at me to get as far away as possible. Elliot moved to the desk, his hand steady as he reached for the notebook. "It's a conduit," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. They're feeding off each other, amplifying their connection. To what? I demanded, my voice rising with panic. To Grinelli? Elliot nodded, his gaze sharp. We need to sever the link. Now. The laughter grew louder, a relentless cacophony that seemed to press against the walls, threatening to tear the room apart. The masks pulsed with light, their energy radiating outward like a storm ready to break. And for the first time I saw it, the shadow. It loomed in the corner of the room, a towering, amorphous shape that seemed to stretch and contort, its edges frayed and flickering like static. It had no face, no form, just an overwhelming presence that radiated malice and intent. Elliot, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It's here. The room seemed to warp and buckle under the weight of the shadow that loomed in the corner. It had no defined edges, no discernible face, but its presence was impossible to deny. A pulsating void that radiated malice. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched it move, a silent, shifting thing that seemed to stretch and contract with every flicker of the lights. Elliot didn't hesitate. He grabbed the notebook and the knife from the desk, his movements precise and deliberate despite the chaos that surrounded us. Miguel, he said, his tone sharp and commanding. We can't let it take control. We have to break the link now. How? I demanded, my voice raw with fear. You said we needed all the masks to finish the ritual. Elliot's eyes met mine, fierce and unyielding. We improvise. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils spreading like ink spilled into water. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the bed as the temperature in the room plummeted. The laughter returned, louder and more dissonant than before, a cacophony of voices overlapping in an unbearable chorus. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, clawing at my thoughts. Elliot dropped to his knees in front of the crate, the notebook open in one hand and the knife gleaming in the other. He muttered under his breath, the words too quiet for me to catch, but the air around him seemed to shift in response. The masks on the desk began to shimmer, their etched patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. The shadow recoiled, its tendrils retreating slightly, but the movement felt calculated, not fearful. It circled the edge of the room like a predator stalking its prey, its shifting form casting grotesque shadows that seemed to mock us. Keep it back, Elliot barked, his attention fixed on the masks. Whatever it takes, don't let it near me. I searched frantically for anything I could use as a weapon, my eyes landing on the iron lamp sitting on the nightstand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I yanked the cord from the wall and gripped the base tightly, the cool metal grounding me as I stepped between Elliot and the encroaching shadow. The thing lunged. I swung the lamp with all the strength I could muster, the metal base colliding with the shadow's tendril. There was no physical resistance, no satisfying impact, but the shadow recoiled as if struck, a high-pitched screech ripping through the air. The laughter faltered, the overlapping voices stumbling over one another before surging back with renewed intensity. It's not enough, I shouted, swinging the lamp again as the tendrils darted toward me. Elliot, whatever you're doing, do it faster. Almost there, he said, his voice strained but steady. His knife moved over the masks with precision, carving intricate symbols into their surfaces. The glow intensified, the patterns shifting and coiling like living things. The shadow lashed out, its tendrils striking the walls with enough force to rattle the entire room. My grip on the lamp tightened as I swung again and again, the cold metal passing through the inky blackness but driving it back nonetheless. Each strike took more effort, my arms growing heavier with every swing, but I refused to let it break through. "Elliot!" I gasped, my chest heaving as the laughter crescendoed into a deafening roar. "I can't hold it off much longer. Just a little more," he snapped, his focus unbroken. The knife moved faster now, the symbols on the masks glowing so brightly they cast jagged shadows across the walls. The air was charged with energy, the pressure building with each passing second. And then, everything stopped. The laughter cut off abruptly, the silence that followed as jarring as the noise had been. The shadow froze, its tendrils hovering midair as if held in place by some unseen force. My breath caught in my throat as I looked to Elliot, who stood over the crate, the knife in one hand and the now blazing masks in the other. "Grinelli," he said, his voice cold and steady, "your time is over." The shadow twisted violently, its form writhing as if in agony. The air seemed to ripple around it, the temperature spiking as the pressure in the room reached a breaking point. Elliot raised the masks high, his voice rising as he shouted the final words of the incantation written in Stokes' notebook. The masks shattered. The explosion of light was blinding, a searing brilliance that engulfed the room and drove the shadow back with a guttural, agonized scream. I threw up my arms to shield my face, the heat of the energy washing over me like a wave. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt, the entire world tilting and spinning as the force of the release rippled outward. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light faded, leaving the room bathed in the faint, flickering glow of the motel's neon sign. The shadow was gone, the oppressive weight of its presence lifted. The crate lay in splinters, the remains of the masks scattered among the debris. Elliot stood in the center of it all, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort of his breaths. "It's done," he said, his voice barely audible. I sank to my knees, the weight of the moment crashing over me in a tidal wave of exhaustion and relief. "Is it really over?" I asked, my voice shaking. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "For now," he said. But Grinelli's web was vast. There could be others out there, masks, artifacts, fragments of his influence. I nodded, too tired to argue. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was still, the silence a welcome reprieve. Whatever lay ahead, we had survived this. And for now, that was enough.